This is Duke University.
Good morning. I'm Elakay Cohen, Director of the Center for European Study at Duke University. I teach in the History Department as well as in Political Science and Religion. And I would first like to thank Jonathan Bouyarin and Shai Ginsburg for organizing this wonderful conference. Our keynote speaker today is Professor Martin Jay, the Sidney Herman Professor of History at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Jay is the most prominent intellectual historian of his generation. אומרים מקצת שבחו של אדם בפניו. One praises one in his or her presence only modestly. So I will not survey here Professor Jay's contribution to modern European intellectual history, critical theory, and visual culture in his books from The Dialectical Imagination to Downcast Eyes to Songs of Experience, but only say that he has been a crucial voice in shaping academic discussion of many of the central theoretical questions for 4 decades. He has the incredible ability to address not only an interdisciplinary academic audience as here today, but also to make theory accessible to wider public audiences, the virtue of a public intellectual. Just before the injunction ועשו סייג לתורה, and make offense to the Torah, that was used yesterday, the Tractate of Abot has another, והעמידו תלמידים הרבה, and create many students. And Professor Jay has been the mentor of many of the intellectual leaders of the next generation of intellectual historians, and through them he has been spreading the Torah, albeit I might indicate a very non-orthodox one. Please join me in welcoming here the topic of his lecture. Today is Leo Lowenthal and the Jewish Renaissance. Professor Jay.
That enormously gracious introduction, and of course I add my thanks to Jonathan and Shai for inviting me and for organizing this incredible event. When I was first invited, I thought of a topic that would be deeply theoretical and very current, which was the ways in which Jews were used figuratively, allegorically in contemporary theory. And then I read Sarah Hammerschlag's book, which did such a brilliant job precisely addressing that question that I decided I could only be a footnote to it. So instead of trying to look at that first issue, I went back to the well, as it were, and returned to my earliest work on the Frankfurt School, and in particular the career of a figure who is less perhaps well recognized today, at least in the United States, who was a colleague at Berkeley for many years, and a dear friend, Leo Lowenthal, as he was known in Germany, who during the 1920s had in fact undergone a very powerful journey through a let's say, renewed Jewish identity, and then, as I'll argue, weaning himself from it. And the issue of the Frankfurt School's relationship to its Jewish background, such as it was, has often been addressed in very general terms. The Bilder Verbot, the famous prohibition on images being seen somehow as a Jewish residue in their works, and so forth. Benjamin, obviously, Eric Fromm, others were explicitly involved, some less so. But the story that I'm going to tell today is perhaps not as well known, and so I hope you'll bear with me if I focus in on the Lowenthal experience. Shayla did a fabulous job yesterday of covering an immensely, let's say, broad territory and bringing it up to date and dealing with contemporary issues having to do with Israel and so forth. This is a somewhat more modest exercise, but I hope that it will at least be some use in giving you a sense of how critical theory and the Jewish dimension of the lives of at least some of its members intersected. On January 24th, 1922, the 21-year-old Leo Lowenthal, then recovering from a bout of tuberculosis at the Black Forest Spa of Menzenschwand, received some shattering news from his friend then in Frankfurt, Siegfried Krakauer. That morning, Rabbi Nehemiah Anton Noble had suddenly and unexpectedly died at the age of only 51. At that moment, Lowenthal, who had been temporarily estranged from his own father, was being supported at the spa by Rabbi Noble. "I know," Krakauer wrote, and I'm citing, "I know how profoundly sad you will be, how much you have lost with him, and extend to you my hand in deepest friendship. I was also indescribably shaken by the sudden death of this man, because I had honored and loved him even if I knew him only from afar. He was entirely spirit. What others had taught, he was. I loved his essence, his wonderfully mild and unassuming goodness, which surrounded him like an atmosphere, yes, even radiated out from him to all, both deserved and undeserved. In an era of extreme skepticism and disbelief, he was to me the revelation of a genuine religious personality. Was he one of the 30 tzaddikim who live in every generation?" The powerful impact of Rabbi Noble's death was felt by others in the close-knit community of his young admirers, among them Franz Rosenzweig, who wrote to Martin Buber on the following day, quote, "You will have already read in the newspaper of the terrible blow that has struck us here. Part of the basis of my life has been snatched from underfoot. We never know our future, but we can nevertheless see before us the beginning of the road that leads into the future. At least we call them fortunate who can see this beginning of the road before them. And until yesterday morning, I would have myself called myself thus." Alluding to, quote, a dark and seemingly hopeless conversation he'd had with Buber only shortly before Rabbi Noble's death, Rosenzweig pleaded, "Stay with us, stay in this world for us." As evidenced by this level of heartfelt anguish, Noble was clearly no ordinary rabbi. He was instead the charismatic leader of an extraordinarily gifted group of young German Jewish intellectuals who were to make their mark in the Weimar Republic and then gain even more fame during their exile to American Palestine after 1933. Obviously not Rosenzweig, but the others. He boasted the cultural Bildung of a German Mandarin. His death, in fact, came just after he gave the second of 3 planned lectures on Goethe, and the rigorous training of a professional philosopher who had written a dissertation on Schopenhauer's theory of beauty in Bonn before going on to Marburg to study with Hermann Cohen. But he was also a spellbinding speaker who astounded audiences with his oratorical power. Writing to a friend after the High Holy Day services in 1921, Rosenzweig groped for words to describe how moved he had been. He writes, "Nobel's sermons were incredibly magnificent. It's impossible to describe. I have nothing to compare with it. Only the very greatest can be measured alongside of it. I too might have the ideas after all, and many men have the rhetoric, but something else is involved here, a final quality, a rapture of the whole man, so that one wouldn't be surprised if he took wing in the end and disappeared. Nothing would be too audacious for him to risk saying at such moments, and there's nothing that would not be true coming from such a mouth," end quote. And then, after reminding his correspondent of his characteristic skepticism about all that Nobel represented, and there's an interesting distinction here between fascination with the man and the substance, that being conservative Judaism, Zionism, mysticism, idealism, all of which Rosenzweig repudiated, he nonetheless concluded, quote, "He prays the way one thinks of people praying only thousands of years ago when the great prayers originated. He speaks to the people as one thinks only the prophets should have been allowed to speak. It's really the spirit as cloudburst." For those in his thrall, Nobel was clearly a life-changing experience, and his premature departure truly traumatic. Lowenthal had found in him a permissive and nurturing father figure to whom he could turn to legitimate his rebellion against his secular, assimilated, liberal father, Victor Lowenthal, a doctor with no patience for the more observant practices embraced, at least for a while, by his son. In an essay he contributed to Der Jüdische Student, Lowenthal wrote, quote, "This death hit me with the force and unexpectedness of a great cosmic event, like the fall of an entire cosmos. Later, this initial feeling," he says, "revealed itself to me as the thought of a space won back from wordless pain, as a key to understanding transience." The German is das Dahingegangene. A half-century later, in his memoirs, Lowenthal could still vividly recall the rabbi's impact, if now with a, let's say, touch of ironic distance. Rabbi Noble, he told his interviewer Helmut Dubiel, Rabbi Noble was a curious mixture of mystical religiosity, philosophical rigor, and quite likely also a more or less repressed homosexual love for young men. It really was kind of a cult community. He was a fascinating speaker. People flocked to hear his sermons. He kept his house open to all, and people would come and go as they pleased. Of course, that was a godsend, especially in the chaotic years after World War I. Now, Nobel's appeal, it's clear in retrospect, was abetted not only by his remarkable personal magnetism and silver tongue, but also by the ability of his followers to see in him what they needed in a turbulent period of rapid and, we have to admit, frightening change. He was an adherent of Orthodox Judaism, having studied rabbinics with German Orthodoxy's leading figure at scale Hildesheimer in Berlin, and a critic of the overly assimilationist reform, a liberal alternative that attracted many adherents in the Wilhelmian period. And yet he was also uneasy with the Orthodox establishment of his day, personally tolerant, in fact, of all varieties of Judaism, and able to maintain close friendships with more liberal figures like Leo Baeck. A fervent defender of the German war effort and supporter of Hermann Cohn's optimistic claim that German culture and Judaism were fully compatible. And in fact, it's fascinating, he was the guy who designed the inscription in Hebrew and German for Cohen's tombstone in Berlin's Weissensee Cemetery. And some of you, I'm sure, have seen it. It's German on one side and Hebrew on the other. Nobel nonetheless identified with the Zionist project of a Jewish homeland. In 1904, in fact, he'd been elected vice president of the Orthodox Zionist organization known as Mizrahi, which sought to counter religious hostility to the establishment of a Jewish state before the coming of the Messiah. A strong believer in the importance of strictly observing Jewish law, Noble was anything but an embodiment of the dry legalism alleged by many Gentile critics from perhaps at least Kant on, who accused Judaism of lacking devotional intensity and experiential immediacy. Instead, he was open to the recovery of mystical currents in Jewish thought, which were so tempting for many in the interwar era. It was thus possible for figures like Martin Buber, still not entirely past that romantic Erlebnis mystique, the kind of mysticism of a certain notion of experience of his early years, figures like Buber and Rosenzweig, whose new thinking spurned the idealist rationalism of Cohn, it was possible for them to find in Noble an inspiration. And despite Buber's initial qualms about Noble's defense of orthodoxy, he joined Rosenzweig and 13 other young admirers in presenting a Festschrift in 1921 to Rabbi Noble to mark his 50th birthday. It was a worthy monument to a figure who made a singular contribution to what became known as the Weimar Jewish Renaissance. The term Jewish Renaissance was actually coined by Buber in an essay in the Jude back, I think, in 1901, or actually in Ost and West in 1901, but nonetheless only really came to its own during the Weimar era. The distinguished roster of contributors to Nobel's Festschrift included Buber, Krakauer, Ernst Simon, Rudolf Hallow, Richard Koch, Edward Strauss, Eugen Meyer, Max Michael, Josef Prager, Bruno Strauss, Robert Weiss, and the young Leo Lowenthal. Lowenthal's contribution had originally been prepared for a seminar at the University of Heidelberg in 1920, a seminar directed by no less a figure than Karl Jaspers. Jaspers, who was then known more as a psychologist than as a basically existentialist philosopher. What he saw as Jaspers', quote, scientific positivism, and this in the guise of this psychology self-understanding. Lowenthal audaciously directed his fire at the chapter on the demonic in Jaspers' recently published book, The Psychology of Worldviews. It came out in 1919. And Lowenthal called this chapter The Devil Incarnate, preferring Goethe's understanding of the demonic as a link between the poet's genius and the divine. He disdained the reductionism, the psychologistic, scientific reductionism he saw in Jaspers' account. As he was to recall many years later, at that time I was in a mystical, radical, syncretic mood, a mixture of revolutionary radicalism, Jewish messianism, infatuation with an ontologically conceived phenomenology, acquaintance with psychoanalysis. All this was blended together to form a very missionary, messianic, Bloch-like, rapturous philosophy, end quote. Bloch-like. Well, as might be expected, Ernst Bloch, whose recently published Geist der Utopie, Spirit of Utopia, had been a major influence on the young Lowenthal, later, in fact, admired the essay. But Karl Jaspers was far less tolerant. Indeed, as Lowenthal remembered, quote, furious, even aggressive and insulting. he showed no pedagogical understanding for this young student, Lowenthal was just 20, who had just let these ideas pour out. After Jasper's outburst, I stood up, bowed to my fellow students, and left the seminar room slamming the door, end quote. Now, despite the qualms of Rosenzweig and Krakauer, let alone those of Jaspers, the essay, The Demonic Draft of a Negative Philosophy of Religion, appeared in that Festschrift for Noble. It's clearly the work, if you look at it today, of a talented, ambitious, but overwrought young man, written in a florid style, syncretic in its adoption of arguments from many different sources, and typical, I would argue, of the early expressionist years of the Weimar Republic. Even Edvard Munch's The Scream makes it an appearance as an example of what Lowenthal called the deep psychological secret of modern agony. Like many other Jews who were increasingly ambivalent about the Mandarin ideology of Bildung, which had captivated assimilating German Jews for generations, I'm sure you know David Sorkin's wonderful book on the origins of that in the early 19th century, Lowenthal looked for more radical solutions to the ills of modernity wherever he could find them. In the words of Michael Levy, who includes Lowenthal in his admiring history of what he calls Jewish libertarian thought in Central Europe, this is a book that I'm sure many of you know. He writes, it's called Redemption Utopia. He writes, the demonic sketched the foundations of a negative theology, which drew upon Marx, Lukács, and Bloch to argue that we're living in a world without God and without redemption, a cold world handed over to despair, a space between paradise and the Messiah which seeks God without finding him, end quote. A cold world. And of course, Bloch had talked about the warm current of Marxism, and in a way, Lowenthal would recapture that sense of this hidden warm current, also seeking a God without finding him, very crucial. Krakauer also would look and not find. Citing Kierkegaard and Bloch, who argue that the demonic must ultimately be overcome, the work concludes, quote, "At the end lies the ruin of all demonology, for the bright messianic light signifies the principled negation and destruction of all that is tenebrous, all that is sort of shadowy. And the useful role of the demonic as that which interrogates without remainder is over in a final, all-comprehensive unio mystica which finds its peace in God the Lord," end quote. Now, not surprisingly, many years later, Lowenthal himself would look back on this essay with the skepticism of maturity, calling it, rather sarcastically, an almost unreadable masterwork, and admitting, quote, "I barely understand a word of it now." When it appeared, Krakauer, who was Lowenthal's older friend, but very close, very intimate with him, wrote a delicately phrased, ambivalent letter, a letter in which he acknowledged the personal depths out of which Lowenthal had composed the essay, admitting that he himself lacked the religious passion, what he called philosophical eros, and metaphysical urgency that he saw in the piece, and also in the work of other writers like Lukács. But he also criticized Lowenthal's undisciplined tone, which smacked, he said, too much of Ernst Bloch's histrionics, that's his word. Recalling a remark of Scheler's about Max Scheler, about Bloch, that his thought was a running amok to God, an Amoklauf zu Gott. Krakauer said the characterization fit the piece as well, that it was a kind of Amoklauf zu Gott. Reacting to Lowenthal's world-negating theological stance, he told his young friend, quote, "Frankly, I don't believe in the messianic time, the fulfilled time." Lukács, he says, means something different. "I don't believe in this God, and when only this desperado attitude is religious, then I am entirely an unreligious man and will remain so," end quote. Now, although there remained echoes of his apocalyptic inclinations in the dissertation that Lowenthal then wrote on the Catholic mystic Franz von Baader in 1923, Lowenthal seems to have been sobered by his friend's critique, whose sentiments Krakauer more or less repeated even more vehemently a few years later in a letter to his younger friend after he read Rosenzweig's Star of Redemption, a book that he also vehemently disliked. Krakauer's disdain for what he saw as religious schwärmerei anticipated the more public break with other members of the Noble Circle he announced in a spirited attack in 1926 in the Frankfurter Zeitung, an attack on the initial volume of the translation of the Hebrew Bible by Buber and Rosenzweig, and it's occasioned quite a sizable recent secondary literature. But whereas Krakauer rarely again returned to Jewish themes, and the only time I've really seen him do that is in the 37 biography he did of Jacques Offenbach. He did so in rather banal terms. In fact, Adorno and Benjamin in their letters wrote dismissively of how superficial his understanding of that dimension of Offenbach was. Whereas Krakow rarely returned, Leo Lowenthal continued, I would argue, to be actively involved in Jewish culture, at least for the better part of the decade, and with subterranean influences later as well. Serving on the advisory board for Jewish refugees and frequently lecturing to audiences at Jewish adult education centers, Lowenthal also wrote for community newspapers such as the Bayerische Israelitische Gemeindezeitung, along interestingly with the young Hannah Arendt and Gershom Scholem, and was co-editor with Ernst Simon of the Jüdische Wochenzeitung. But he grew progressively disaffected by the latter's rather unreflective support of Jewish settlements on Arab land in Palestine. This is one of the earliest evidences of a kind of anti, or at least non-Zionism in Frankfurt School theory. He wrote a quite interesting essay, rather sort of obliquely anti-Zionist, called Die Lehren von Chinas, the teaching from China, in which he compared events in China of his day in which Westerners were buying up lands from rich landowners with those in Palestine, in both cases predicting a rebellion of dispossessed peasants. It's interesting, in a way, kind of materialist critique, we might say, of the class implications of what was going on even in the 1920s in Palestine. His allegiance to Zionism, such as it was, had always in fact been ambivalent. Although he did join the Zionist movement while a student in Heidelberg, he had reassured his parents in 1920, quote, "I am not, perhaps still not a Zionist. I am a searcher, Suchender, a problematic man. I will never be satisfied with formula." But he found other ways to affirm his Jewish identity. For example, Lowenthal remained an active member of the psychoanalytic circle around Frieda Reichmann, to whom he had been introduced by his wife Golda, and to whom he in turn introduced her soon-to-be husband, Erich Fromm. She was, as some of you know, an observant Jew as well as a Zionist, whose practice, psychoanalytic practice in Heidelberg, was sometimes called, with a kind of touch of mockery but also affection, Torah-poetic, instead of therapeutic. The Torah is somehow involved in the therapy. And her sanatorium in Heidelberg, Lowenthal would remember, was a kind of Jewish psychoanalytic boarding school and hotel. An almost cult-like atmosphere prevailed there. It's interesting, the cult, they talked about the cult around Noble here too, cult-like atmosphere prevailed. Everyone, he said, including me, was psychoanalyzed by Frieda Reichmann. The sanatorium adhered to Jewish religious laws. The meals were kosher, and religious holidays were observed. The Judeo-religious atmosphere intermingled with the interest in psychoanalysis. And then he significantly added, somehow in my recollection, I sometimes link this syncretic coupling of the Jewish and the psychoanalytic traditions with our later marriage, for quotation marks, of Marxist theory and psychoanalysis at the Institute for Social Research, which was to play such a great role in my intellectual life. So we see here these sort of moments of belonging to communities, syncretically mixing things that had previously been kept apart, anticipating his later work at the Institute. Before, however, turning to the meaning of that parallel, it's necessary to pause with another aspect of Lowenthal's continued involvement with Jewish issues in the 20s. That being the series of lectures he composed on a number of eminent German Jewish thinkers, which he intended to turn into a book called Judaism and Jewishness in Recent German Philosophy. As early as 1922, in an essay he jointly wrote with Ernst Simon, Erich Fromm, Fritz Goethen, and Erich Michaelis, he had bemoaned the anti-intellectual celebration of Hasidism espoused by naive followers of Martin Buber, who they claimed, nothing of the deeper intellectual resources in the German Jewish tradition itself. In other words, this fascination with the Ostjuden, with this occasion, this understood to be alternative to the dryness of the Jewish tradition in idealist Germany, in the Hasidic tales and so forth that Buber was then, in a way, creating as a kind of major source of renewal. In this series of talks, given at the Frankfurt Lehrhaus and other Jewish venues in Western Germany, Lowenthal explored the contributions of a number of major European intellectuals with Jewish backgrounds. And he begins even before the modern period with Maimonides. But then these talks include ones on Moses Mendelssohn, on Solomon Maimon, on Heinrich Heine. And they finish with lectures on Karl Marx, Ferdinand Lassalle, Hermann Cohen, and Sigmund Freud. Lowenthal was careful to include figures who both identified and not identified with specifically Jewish themes. Figures from both Western Germany and those who had more Eastern origins. And he claimed the latter had to be understood more in terms of their biographical struggles than the former, and also those who were, in a way, battling with emancipation into bourgeois society and those battling to escape from it. Now, the first thing that strikes a contemporary reader of these talks is, in fact, the depth of Lowenthal's mastery of the work and lives of a very wide range of difficult thinkers. I mean, these are essays written by a guy in his 20s, and we're talking about some, pretty difficult and very, very prolific thinkers. I mean, from Maimonides up to Freud. And these are very, very, in some sense, brilliant little essays. They're still worth reading. They've been republished both in English and German in the last few years. Quite amazing in terms of their insights and universal ideals. Perhaps Lowenthal's most vivid portrait is of Heinrich Heine, which begins with the blunt question, why did Heine become a Christian? Why did Heine become a Christian? Tacitly resonating with the reasons for Heine's disillusionment, and I think he himself shared this sense of why he did it, he argues that the poet was deeply alienated from the watered-down Reform Judaism in the Germany of his day, which Lowenthal had also left behind. That Reform Judaism had left itself its creative period at the time with Mendelssohn and turned into a veiled version of Christianity, the pseudo-faith of what he called the Sunday Jews. Rather, however, than returning to an earlier version of Judaism, which he mistakenly identified with a dogmatic fanaticism and wan legalism, Heine had chosen baptism, but not only, as his famous explanation had it, not only as an entry ticket to European culture. By adopting Christianity, Heine, as Lowenthal described him, was really struggling to realize the redemptive mission of Judaism, understood in universal terms. Quote, Heine had submitted to Christianity in order to be able to destroy it in a messianic rage. For Heine, European culture means the Europe of the French Revolution. It means the possibility of a joyful, free, and full life. It is a horrible historical irony that this specifically Jewish side of Heine, this love for a worthy life of free persons, is what drove him out of Judaism. So it's an interesting sort of notion that there's an essence of Judaism which is a love for a worthy life of freedom, and somehow it moved him beyond official allegiance to Judaism. Judaism, especially in its prophetic tradition, was thus the source of a more universal impulse that survived Heine's self-exile from a version of it that had failed to realize its more ambitious goals. Something similar informed Lowenthal's reading of Marx. The disturbing expression of what we can only call anti-Semitism in Marx's notorious essay on the Jewish question, whose odiousness Lowenthal does not try to deny, is attributed to, quote, Marx's profound ignorance of Jewish cultural values. Then he adds, there remains, in spite of it all, the twofold nature of his claims. On the one hand, the protest against the fact that Judaism can be the symbol of capitalism. On the other hand, the Jewish universalist manner in which the protest is carried out. So here, too, there's some essence of Judaism which allows Lowenthal still to identify with it. Likewise, in the very final essay of the series, which dealt with Sigmund Freud, and it's interesting, a few weeks later, Freud was to receive the Goethe Prize in Frankfurt, an honor that Lowenthal himself had been able to do much to assure. In the final essay of the series, he squeezed out of Freud's Jewish background a very general lesson. Quote, if we want to speak of Freud's relation to Judaism, we must direct our attention to those qualities he displays in the whole of life. Help and reconstruction for individuals and for society as a whole, that is the star that illuminates Freud's life and work, end quote. Now, by the time of that final essay in the series, written at the end of the decade, Lowenthal's overtly Jewish commitments had, in fact, I think, palpably waned. Perhaps he had absorbed some of Siegfried Krakauer's sourness about the enthusiasms of his youth. Perhaps he was reflecting the general turn in Weimar culture against the apocalyptic messianism of the early expressionist years, the years when Ernst Bloch was riding high. Perhaps he was over that rebellion against his parents and their values. Whatever the cause, he had already joined the third of the outsider intellectual communities, first being the Noble Circle, the second, the psychoanalytic group around from Reichmann, the third of the communities that would become a more permanent resting place for his contrarian and utopian strivings, that being the Institute of Social Research in Frankfurt around Max Horkheimer. He'd been introduced to Horkheimer by his school-time friend Felix Weil, whose wealthy father's generosity had financed the Institute's founding back in 1924. Now, Horkheimer himself had in fact never been in the thrall of Rabbi Noble, remembering in fact many years later, quoted, "I must emphatically say that I did not belong to that circle. I did not know the rabbi. I had never seen him. I didn't belong already for the reason that this rabbi was the complete opposite of liberal Judaism. He represented conservative Judaism." And Horkheimer didn't have rebellion against liberal Judaism. Adorno, 3 years younger than Lowenthal, and also a protege of Siegfried Kracauer, Adorno had even less use for Noble in his circle, though perhaps he may have found some indirect inspiration in Rosenzweig's ideas as conveyed at least by Benjamin and Scholem. Only half Jewish in origin, Adorno's mother is from a Catholic background. He was baptized as a Catholic, and his father, in fact, assimilated, displayed, as one biographer says, a somewhat ostentatious aversion to everything that was consciously Jewish. Adorno was never himself drawn to the Ostjuden, never had any respect for their champions like Martin Buber. He was very contemptuous of Buber's latest, his Jagd der Eigentlichkeit in the 50s. Nor did he ever consider, let alone try to realize, a return to orthodox practice as a rebuke to his parents. And Adorno, it's quite fascinating that you think of Oedipal rebellions as typical of this era. Adorno never rebelled against his parents at all. And if you look at the letters that were written between himself and his parents to the end of their lives after the migration, they're filled with an incredible admiration, respect, love, affection, intimacy. He talks to his mother about his love affairs with women outside his marriage. I mean, it's an amazing sort of correspondence in some ways. This was not the case with most people. Adorno was unique in many respects. But in any event, he also, in fact, he was often backbiting. Adorno was. He refers to Lowenthal and Fromm in a letter to Horkheimer as professional Jews. I mean, obviously he had no sense of that being a good thing. And as his influence in the Institute grew, Adorno's influence grew, and Erich Fromm's diminished, the palpable residues of Jewish themes were attenuated. Now, assessments of the Frankfurt School's debts, often reluctantly acknowledged to Jewish sources, have been attempted at many times. And there are lots of arguments about how explicit or implicit. While it's clear that anti-Semitism did become a focal point of their work, especially in the wake of the Holocaust, they often tended to subsume specifically Jewish themes and issues under larger rubrics. And perhaps the most egregious example of this was an essay written in 1939 by Max Horkheimer in one of the last issues of the Zeitschrift Sozialforschung called Die Juden in Europa, the Jews in Europe, which occasioned a violent condemnation by Gershom Scholem in the last letter he ever wrote to Walter Benjamin before the latter's suicide. It's really quite a vitriolic letter attacking Horkheimer as a despicable figure. Despite its title, Juden in Europa, the essay in fact virtually does ignore Jewish issues and concentrates instead on the relationship between fascism and capitalism. Lowenthal, however, was, I think, at least a partial exception to this rule. He seems, for example, to have remained convinced that Heine's Jewish identity was central to his cosmopolitan redemptive project. And it's interesting that in 1947, after he was in New York and had migrated, even beginning to move away from the Institute, he published a translation of his Weimar essay in Commentary magazine, the major organ of the liberal Jewish intelligentsia in America, then edited by Elliott Cohn. And the Commentary we know now, of course, is very right-wing. In the 40s, it was not. In his recent account of the Institute's American years, Thomas Wheatland, in fact, focuses on the role of this essay in cementing relations between Horkheimer's circle and the New York intellectuals of that era. It was, Wheatland writes, quote, a powerfully crafted example of the kind of Jewish exploration that Elliott Cohn and the rest of the editorial board of Commentary were encouraging. The figure of Heinrich Heine functioned for Lowenthal as a symbol for the problems faced by the entire New York intellectual community and by many German Jewish exiles as well, end quote. And what did this mean? Well, rather than being a way station to full conversion, full assimilation, and the loss of any residual Jewish identification, Heine's journey, as Lowenthal describes it, ends with his disillusion with Christianity, and is best understood as a kind of cautionary tale. Thus, through Heine, Wheatland concludes, through Heine was Lowenthal able to discover a distinctly Jewish identity consistent with critical theory, and the pre-war political impulses that gathered the Horkheimer circle together. In the wake of the war, Heine stood as a symbol. Perhaps all Jewish exiles could return home, could find some sort of, I don't know what, inspiration, make peace with their own Jewish backgrounds rather than fully repudiate them. It's interesting that when other members of the school turned their attention to figures like Heine after the Holocaust, they did not, however, adopt Lowenthal's earlier focus on his Jewish roots. Thus, for example, in a talk that Adorno gave in 1956 for the Heine centenary, a talk that has become quite widely discussed, called Heine the Wound, Heine's romantic lyric poetry, Adorno argues, was ultimately a failure because it could not really attain the fluency in the German language it sought. As such, it was an expression, so Adorno says, of the failure of Jewish emancipation, which now has become emblematic of a more general human condition of homelessness. He writes, "There is no longer any homeland other than a world in which no one would be cast out anymore, the world of a genuinely emancipated humanity. The wound that is Heine will heal only in a society that has achieved reconciliation," end quote. So here the conclusion drawn by Adorno was diametrically opposed to that somewhat more optimistic lesson that, if Wheatland is right, was implied in Lowenthal's piece and which inspired the republication of it in English in commentary. In 1986, in an essay by Jürgen Habermas entitled Heinrich Heine and the Role of the Intellectual in Germany, even less attention is paid to Heine's Jewish background, as he's portrayed as a critical Enlightenment intellectual. A lot of emphasis on that word, a word with, of course, mostly negative connotations in Germany, who had been marginalized by the Mandarin Geistigen, kind of difficult word to translate, sort of non-intellectual, spiritual Mandarins who dominated German letters until after World War II. The difference between the intellectual Heinrich Mann and the Geistige Thomas Mann. It's Heine, in fact, the hedonist, the democrat, the politically engaged thinker who nonetheless defended artistic autonomy. It's that Heine, rather than Heine the self-questioning Jew, who is at the center of Habermas's analysis. Although noting in passing that, quote, the hatred that battered Heine as a Jew and an intellectual all his life made him well aware of the double-edged nature, end quote, of German nationalism, Habermas ignores any positive legacy that Heine might have taken from the Jewish tradition. Now, Lowenthal himself, it has to be admitted, for a very long time after the publication of this essay and commentary, was basically inclined to do the same, to minimize the importance. Perhaps because the ethnic identities of Institute members had so often been evoked by their enemies, he and his colleagues were in fact reticent to give them ammunition for the slurs. Although sharing the Frankfurt School's frequent identification of the Jewish taboo on picturing God with their own reluctance to spell out what utopia might look like, he distanced himself from what he dismissively called the later Horkheimer's adoption of, quote, concrete religious symbolism. But in the interviews that he gave near the end of his life, Lowenthal did acknowledge that he had underestimated the importance of Jewish motifs in his work and those of his colleagues at the Institute. I do believe, he finally conceded, that a Jewish element, if you want to call it that, was alive in most of us, consciously or unconsciously, in the sense of it is yet to come. That is, of hope, of the unspeakable, which cannot be named but only sensed, which can only be negatively determined. And then he says, and that I want to acknowledge even today, for it does unite in a certain way the hope now seriously compromised for a life of dignity for every person, with the thought that it will probably not happen, and that a tragic element is bound irrevocably to our life. So the famous pessimism of the Frankfurt School tied only to that sliver still of hope in dignity for all. But if one could say that Lowenthal's Jewish impulses, broadly speaking, those of Fromm, Benjamin in a more attenuated way, and most of his other Institute colleagues, did find their way into critical theory, what about his contribution to the Weimar Jewish Renaissance itself? In many ways, his participation was typical of his generation, rebelling against parental authority, rebelling against conventional Mandarin academic life, looking for a new community of belief, a cult if you want to call it that, often led by a charismatic leader. Although some of the other young Jews who came of age during and after World War I and were swept up in the apocalyptic mood of those years remained more or less in its thrall, Lowenthal moved quickly on. His Zionism, as we've seen, such as it was already pretty much a thing of the past by 1925, and he never contemplated migration to Palestine. Nor did his writing retain any marks of the expressionist rapture that had entranced Bloch and so appalled Krakauer in his early essay on the demonic. Those essays written in the 1920s on the German Jewish intellectuals, very different tone. The inspiration for his personal attempt to live an Orthodox life did not, in fact, long survive the death of Rabbi Noble. And by the mid-20s, he had cast his lot with the materialists, even atheists, I suppose, around Horkheimer at the Institute. And if Rabbi Noble had lived, we don't know, but clearly Lowenthal, in a way, recovered from his infatuation. Now, in retrospect, Lowenthal's trajectory, therefore, looks as if it moved him past the Jewish Renaissance and back into another version of universal assimilationism, albeit no longer the liberal variety that he'd in fact spurned in his father's generation. But if we take a more capacious view of the ways in which Jewish life renewed itself during that era, perhaps another conclusion might suggest itself, and I want to finish with this thought. To reach it, let me return to the expressions of sorrow greeting Rabbi Noble's sudden death by Lowenthal and Franz Rosenzweig, both of which evidence that profound loss which they felt. Significantly, however, only a short while after the rabbi's death, Rosenzweig presented a far more nuanced and even in some ways rather negative picture to his friend Josef Prager. He writes, "You evidently don't know how I stood with Noble. More particularly, you're unaware of the negative side of our relation. I respected only the Talmudic Jew, not the humanist, only the poet, not the scholar, only the prophet, not the philosopher. I rejected," Rosenzweig says, "the qualities I did reject because in the form in which he had them, they were deeply un-Jewish. At least this is what I always felt. All my veneration and love never blinded me to this toying with Christian pagan ideas. True, it couldn't do me any harm, since I am armored against this kind of temptations. Perhaps no other Jew in Galut has been before me. But in the effect he had on others," Rosenzweig says, "I was always aware of the poison mixed with the medicine. Had I met him sooner, say 10 years ago, he might possibly have driven me away from Judaism. More likely he would have completely ruined me." And then he added, with a touch, I suppose, of arrogance, "What I've learned from Noble is that the soul of a great Jew can accommodate many things. There's danger only for the little souls," end quote. Now, from Rosenzweig's perspective, Lowenthal's later development away from his Jewish commitments would seem, in fact, to corroborate this very fear. Noble's inspiration, in his case, did allow for an openness to the broader currents of German thought. He writes on Bader, he's interested in Goethe and so forth. They're still, to be sure, intermingled with the residues of the Jewish. But whether or not this trajectory can be taken as evidence of a little soul is something else. Rosenzweig may have had a very exclusivist notion of what constituted unpolluted Jewish purity, but I think we need not follow his lead. As David Beale has recently shown in his masterful study of the tradition of Jewish secular thought, there has been a robust alternative to normative definitions of, quote, authentic Jewish identity, whether understood religiously or culturally. Rather than niggling over the proper credentials for inclusion in a club of the righteous, it's opened its door to a wide range of people whose debts to and identification with the rich legacy of Jewish experience and textual reflection on it are not homogeneous. Ironically, even those figures like Leo Lowenthal, who did not tarry with the religious identities they once fashioned in rebellion against their assimilated parents, even they too must be accounted full-fledged participants in that narrative. At the end of his study of the Weimar Jewish Renaissance, Michael Brenner turns to the towering figure of the Hebrew novelist and Nobel Prize laureate Shmuel Yosef Agnon. He writes, "In contrast to most German Jewish writers, Agnon abstained from both stigmatizing German Jews as assimilated non-Jewish Jews, the old line of Isaac Deutscher, and idealizing, quote, authentic East European Jews. Agnon," Brenner tells us, "demonstrated his respect for the multifaceted achievements of German Jews." Young Leo Lowenthal, I think, would not have agreed with this verdict. He was in favor of the Ostjuden, hostile to the assimilated, but as he matured and left behind, or more correctly tempered, the apocalyptic intransigence and messianic yearnings of his early years, he, I think, would surely have come to recognize its wisdom. Indeed, only through his remarkable capacity to absorb impulses from many different sources, no matter their religious or cultural pedigree, did Lowenthal develop into the genuine Renaissance man that those of us who were privileged to have known him remember so well. Thanks very much.
great talk. I mean, just two quick comments. I mean, one is the description of Agnon as it being, it does bore. I mean, it's simply, you know, when we look at the Agnon's description of, I mean, he has a couple of beautiful stories about the prayers of Jews in Jerusalem when he's wandering from one shul to another. And he's describing the German Jews as arrogant, having no spiritual life. I mean, it's very clear. I mean, his attitude towards German Jews in terms of their prayers, that they are very fancy, they have very fancy voices, but they are not sincere, they are not authentic. I mean, you find it very clearly now. So that's one point. But the other issue about Talmudism, you know, Noble himself would be a very limited Talmudist because, as a matter of fact, I mean, by the mid-19th century, 1850, the last two yeshivot in Germany were closed. Würzburg and I don't remember the other one, but that's what you had Orthodox Jews. You had the Hilsheimer Seminar in Berlin. But the Hilsheimer Seminar is, you know, in terms of Talmudic learning, is not a very impressive place. I mean, you know, one of the most fascinating stories is the story of Ludwig Stein, the editor of the Archiv für Geschichte der Philosophie, the founder of the Archiv für Geschichte der Philosophie. He's born in Papa, goes at the age of 13, studies in the traditional yeshiva in Papa. At the age of 13, his parents immigrate to Holland for 1 year, then to Berlin. At the age of 14, he comes to a Hilsheimer seminar. It took them 3 months to realize that he knows probably much better than most of his teachers. They, on the spot, after 4 or 5 months, they appointed him a rabbi. And after 3 years, at the age of 16 and a half or 17, he just leaves everything. But in his memoirs, he's just saying, you know, there is no comparison in terms of the ability to study Talmud between what I studied in Papa and Hilsheimer. So, you know, Hilsheimer is more scientific, but in terms of serious study, they are not playing the same league.
I have no stake in the description of Agnon as correct that Michael Brenner gives us, but it's simply the sense that a more capacious, forgiving, and inclusive version of what constitutes the virtues, let's say, of different Jewish identities is one that also would characterize, I think, what Lowenthal took from it. So, Agnon aside, I think that's the larger message that that passage suggests. And it's interesting to think that maybe Brenner gets it wrong. As for the depth of the background of Noble, I mean, I think probably anyone who was as let's say, spread thin as he was, you know, studying philosophy, active in the way that he was active, and a master of German humanist culture, that whatever he took from the more orthodox tradition might have been thinner than perhaps people who were utterly and completely devoted just to it. So I'm sure you're right. I mean, here too I have no particular stake in defending Noble as a serious Talmudist. I mean, I think Lowenthal himself, this is all pretty much a kind of eclectic whirl of different, perhaps semi-garbled impulses that if you try to unpack them, if you look at this essay on the demonic, it's practically unintelligible now. I mean, I'm not sure that it really is a serious essay that one would look to for any guidance. I mean, he's only 20 years of age. It's a symptom more than anything else. So it is, I'm sure, true that during the Weimar Renaissance there are differing degrees, let's say, of learned appropriation. And, you know, obviously in, say, Schollem's critique of Buber and so forth, there are lots of variations in terms of what people think of as a deeper rather than shallower appropriation. I mean, I'm, I guess, more interested in what they make of it rather than whether or not what they make of it is good. So I take your caution about, giving them the accreditation, as it were, that they perhaps might have claimed simply by just grabbing it themselves. But it's less important than what they made of it than where they came from.
It's such a rich evocation, and thank you so much. And it makes me just, kind of wish I had been there, and also glad that I wasn't. But thinking more sociologically, or in terms of patterns of identification and disidentification, I'm struck once again at the seemingly real but very vague and difficult to capture phenomenon of Jews, and maybe Jewish intellectuals in particular, and maybe not, tending to have these phases of strong, explicit identification early in life and late in life, and more or less to set it aside while they're doing their adult business in the wider world. And I would associate it as an anthropologist with some aspect of a desire to identify with ancestry. At both, the 20-year-old wants to identify with grandparents and the great-grandparents, and is angry at the parents for having cheated him of that, and with their base, short-sighted parental ways. The old person wants to feel some identification, entering into something also that doesn't end with the end of that organism. Does that?
Well, no. I think obviously there's a psychosocial generational thing going on, and Weimar is a particularly rich period for that kind of acting out one way or another. The relationship to the past, you're absolutely right, there's this kind of anger at the father for, in a way, squandering the legacy that he'd been bequeathed, and a desire to recover something that was...
See it in Kafka also, in the letter to the father.
No, indeed. No, there's no question that it's a powerful theme during this era. And there's remember the old book by Weinstein and Platt, The Wish to be Free, which deals with a generational revolt. He talks about Kafka, talks about Freud, talks about Max Weber, a lot of other things, Jewish and Gentile, who are undergoing a kind of complicated rebellion against fathers who failed them, who were seen as, basically weaker and, not as in touch with something that had been around before. I mean, in different cases, different, substance. Now, what's interesting about this Lowenthal recovery of what went before, and that's why the Bloch link is so important. Bloch's version of the heritage, as it were, is not of what was once powerfully present and is worthy of being recovered. It's not anamnestic. It's rather a desire to recover the not yet foretaste of what might become in the future. So what you discover is not a form of life that you affirm, but rather yearnings, hopes, desires, fantasies, dreams, utopian, this noch nicht idealism, which has been, in a way, not yet realized, but which has been forgotten. So I think that's the crucial kind of trick, that it's discovering the past to discover a potential future, not discovering the past, which in and of itself is valid and simply been lost. So that's what Lowenthal obviously gets out of this kind of recovery of the demonic and these other dimensions of his maybe phantasmatic version of what religion provided. And I think that does endure even in the middle period of relative distancing from the explicit Jewish quality of this feeling. That in the Frankfurt School in general, there's always a sense of using the past creatively. I mean, they're not modernists who want to get rid of the past. I mean, whether they're going back to myth or religion, Bader, there are other versions of that in the work that they did, where they recover resources in counter-revolutionary earlier figures, but always with the hope that they could be reconfigured in a critical way for some redemptive future. And Benjamin also the same kind of finding in Baroque or whatever, as sparks of something that could be then somehow rekindled. So I think that's the complicated dialectic. And a lot of the secular power of the work is generated by the covert messianism. I mean, Adorno's famous line in Minima Moralia that everything has to be seen from the point of view of redemption, of Erlösung. What exactly that means is not clear, but redemption still is a powerful term in his vocabulary. And then, as you say, Horkheimer, in particular, at the end of his life, recovers a kind of connection with the Jewish community in Germany, and they have a complicated attitude towards Israel. It's very interesting to see how they identify strongly in 1967 with the Israeli state, and feel that it needs to be, in some sense, defended. I mean, I think most of them moved away from that position later, but in '67 they still felt that linkage. I mean, that Adorno less so perhaps because he wasn't fully Jewish, but nonetheless that was crucial. Then, of course, the Holocaust enters in other dimensions.
I'm very interested in the figure of Heine and
Yes,
the point of
yes.
comparison between Hannah Arendt and Lowenthal. And Arendt talks about Heine in the Life of the Jews, Rahel Varnhagen, and then in the Self-Conscious Pariah essay. And it's the encounter with Heine that kind of is a certain return to a certain kind of Jewishness, precisely this capacious Jewishness, and embrace of the ideas of freedom and specifically worldliness,
Right.
understood as something Jewish. So it's very interesting how Heine figures as a return to Jewishness in spite of the conversion.
Right.
So I'm curious if you see any explicit points.
Well, it's an excellent thought. I haven't systematically looked at the comparison. I think it's something I should do. I mean, Lowenthal and Arendt knew one another. They were not particularly close. I mean, Hannah Arendt had a very complicated relationship with the Frankfurt School ever since Adorno's, dismissal of her first husband's work in the 1920s, and then, of course, through Benjamin and through her relation to Heidegger. And so there's a lot of enmity. And there's a new collection of essays edited by Lars Remsman and I think Samir Gandesha on Adorno and Arendt, which tries to sort it all out. But no, I think you're right. I mean, Heine is a figure that many German Jews, often on the left, but not always, found difficult, problematic, and yet inspirational in some ways. I mean, a figure who they could take seriously, a modern figure, and yet someone who was in touch with these earlier impulses, a figure whose life had a tragic dimension, obviously, a figure who transcended the parochialism of German thought because he was interested in things French. So in some ways, a very powerful, and merely as a poet whose sardonic tone they could also identify with, I mean, a poet who moved beyond the kind of romantic schremelei. So I think he was on a kind of Rorschach test for many of them, and I think they projected a lot of stuff onto him. And I think they still are. I mean, I was fascinated when I tried to compare these later essays, Habermas and Adorno, with the Lowenthal essay. I don't think anyone's ever quite put the three of them together. And each of them finds in Heine a different Heine. And I think if we added Hannah Arendt, we'd probably find yet another. So I think it's a worthwhile comparison to make.
Time period that you are addressing here, we're talking about really competing strands of Zionism. So I wonder if you can elaborate on what strand of Zionism he felt in one way or another. Thinking about territorial, political, spiritual, all this.
Right. My guess is if he, and I think it was pretty superficial, if he had been attracted, it would have been to the cultural Haraam version rather than a strongly political one. And certainly, after that 25 essay, he never returned in a positive way to Zionism. I mean, he never attacked Zionism, but when he goes back in the autobiographical interviews, he's very proud of his prescience in that essay on China, which is a veiled essay about Palestine. His prescience in showing the dangers in the Jewish appropriation of land from Arab landowners. So I think he was always... Now, the other Frankfurt School members, there are some places where Horkheimer is very nervous about Zionism. He doesn't feel fully comfortable with aspects of it. And yet, as I said, in '67, they felt a close allegiance. There is a fascinating moment later, after '67, when Herbert Marcuse goes to Israel and has a meeting with Moshe Dayan. And this has been published. Telos has a collection of the transcript and a translation of the transcript. It's fascinating. He basically says to Moshe Dayan, you were right in 1967, that Israel was right to defend itself. Not the settlements, not what you're doing now in the lands you've occupied. It's only a couple of years later, so not much had been done, but still that he doesn't buy. But the identification with Israel is necessarily defending itself. So there it is a political state, there it is something that has its legitimacy. Lowenthal, I don't think, ever fully developed a strong attitude towards Israel one way or the other. But if it had been in the 20s a version of Zionism, it would, my guess, have been the cultural one rather than the political one.
hope as what could be seen as primarily grounding their identities as Jewish. And maybe you could just say a little bit more about that. I mean, first of all, would the source of that necessarily have had to have been within the resources of Judaism, or perhaps a certain reading of those sources? And so that's on the sort of, on one hand, of one temporal side. The other temporal side, I mean, do we see this carrying forward? Do we see this moving on later in terms of less traditional forms of Judaism, the sense of messianism, hope, as somehow a primarily identifying Jewish feature?
You know, I think it's to some extent creative and maybe garbled and maybe, you know, from a serious philological and philosophical point of view, unearned. That is to say that they read selectively and they choose aspects of the tradition for their own purposes. Whether or not they then are deeply imbued with, you know, the understanding would make it defensible is something else. But certainly it was part of this mood from 1917, 1918 through the early 20s, mixed with the Russian Revolution, mixed with what was going on in Central Europe, the apocalypse produced by the failure of the German war effort, because these people were more or less, I mean, Benjamin went to Switzerland, Bloch went to Switzerland, but most of them were still, you know, Lowenthal served in the German army in 1918, were pro-German in the war effort, the way Hermann Cohn had been, the way Buber had been, and so forth. So this was a very drastic moment of great, I think, psychological trauma. And there was also a strong sense of the father's generation failing. It's a wonderful book by Paul Federn called, what is it called? Vaterlose Gesellschaft, a society without the fathers. So the patriarchal bourgeois fathers, whatever, all have been somehow, you know, in kind of almost Freudian totem and taboo way destroyed, and that helped to unleash or to make plausible this kind of messianic apocalyptic moment, which moved beyond the caution and probity and worldliness of their fathers. Now, does it survive? And there's a quite, I think, brilliant book by one of my students, Benjamin Lazier, that you may know, called God Interrupted, which deals with Jewish heretical thought in the Weimar era. And he talks mostly about Scholem, about Hans Jonas, and about Leo Strauss, going in very different directions with all types of Gnostic and Manichaean and other, you know, trends that were developed in interesting and complicated ways. So it does linger, and whether it lingers a la Scholem in a somewhat scholarly way or informs in a deeper sense some of the, you know, the writings that people like Jonas and Strauss did later, one would have to follow it very closely. But it is, I think, a powerful current. I mean, the one book that maybe overly romanticizes it is Michel Louvy's book, Redemption Utopia, which deals with a lot of figures. Kafka's included, the literary as well as philosophical and political figures during that era, right after World War I. He has a chapter on Leo Lowenthal. So that redemptive utopian romantic moment, and Michel Louvy is, you know, he's a quite wonderful guy, a good friend of mine in Paris, who is very much still wedded to that. I mean, he's a kind of romantic Trotskyist who thinks that the revolution will, in fact, finally redeem mankind. So, you know, he found in these people kindred spirits, and so I think it did have attenuated and complicated residues even after that brief expressionist, apocalyptic Geist der Utopie moment.
Sam. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. You consciously danced around his sort of associations with and time in the Frankfurt School because you were doing something else. But I wanted, maybe you could say a little bit more about what attracted him there. He sort of seems to be sort of on the fringe, sort of like Benjamin, and not sort of a central figure. But there were lots of other things happening in late Weimar. The University of Berlin had extraordinary scholars and a lot of sort of Eastern Jews who had come to study. There were other groups he could have associated with and maybe been more central to than the Frankfurt School. So sort of taking what you talked about here, what then sort of on the Marxist, more economic, more social research side was attractive to him maybe?
Well, you know, mixed with the Jewish moment in his work, there was also a strong socialist, pacifist, you know, let's say political moment during the period right after the war. And a lot of these figures, Felix Weil in particular, were involved with serious socialist movements in Frankfurt and elsewhere. Weil was supporter of the Moloch Verlag, was very close to Georg Gross, was a sponsor of many different leftist ventures through the money that his father, Hermann Weil, had bequeathed him. Horkheimer also came from a privileged background, as did Pollock, and they were, in some ways, outside the mainstream of the academic world, although with one foot in it. Now, how Lowenthal comes into this milieu, it's partly through friendship networks. And that's the fascinating thing about how, why, this particular moment, but people congeal into these kind of groups that become somehow significant later on, but that moment people come and they go. Fromm is important, and later in the mid-30s he begins to move away from them, and ultimately there's a break and so forth. Adorno becomes more significant. Krakauer is always on the fringe, never gets along with Horkheimer very well, close to Adorno and close to Lowenthal and Benjamin. So there are, I would say, complicated personal relationships, sometimes competitive. Lowenthal and Adorno, Lowenthal is 3 years older, born in 1900, Adorno in 1903, vie for the favor of Krakauer, who's 10 years older, and Horkheimer later. A lot of sort of oddly collaborative, but also, what we call personal rivalries. So, as you see in the Noble circle, as you see in the Friedrich von Reichmann circle in Heidelberg, it's not just intellectual. There's a lot of stuff going on, psychological and emotional stuff that binds them together as embattled groups that are facing a hostile world, or somehow enclaves of meaningfulness in a world that they see as barren and lacking in meaning. So why this particular group rather than another? I think it's somewhat adventitious. Just by chance, he happened to have gone to school with Felix Weil, and is a Frankfurt kind of guy, so that's where he stayed. But it's an interesting question how how the Jena Romantics got together.
Is this still important for how we should be doing theory?
Well, I wouldn't.
May I have a rider for this one,
sure.
which will join actually Itzik Melamed's first question and Noah's question here. The question is about the definition of the Jewish that goes into
Right.
the Jewish European. And I wouldn't have the Talmudic essentialism that Itzik has in terms of Noble is out and there, but I think the complaint is in general that we can speak about those as Jews responding to historical situations in the way in which they are defined and opting in particular directions. The other way is, what is traditional Judaism in the Jewish European history that we tell? Does it have any space there?
Well, these are two related but slightly different questions. I would say, first of all, what relevant lesson we can get. Theoreticians generally tend to distance themselves from the contingent roots of their point of view, their argumentation. They want to be people who are essentially decontextualized and argue, speak eternitatis. And what we discover, as intellectual historians in particular, but in any sort of understanding of the specific constellation which creates a theory, that they both transcend and also are indebted to where they come from. Now, how we define where they come from, there are 100 different possible ways. Psychological, something to do with the groups which they belong to, maybe something deeper like a national or religious identity, whatever the kind of series of explanatory categories might be, and how you then translate that into the theory, refracted through it, embodied in it, or enabled by it, or sometimes disabled by it, is a very interesting question. And I think any theoretician who thinks that he or she has transcended his roots is usually fooling himself. And of course, and this comes back to the sort of end-of-life thing. Most of the time people, while they're active, try to either suppress or forget that origin. And then later they say, well, it's really true that I, in fact, I'm expressing something that was part of my generation, and they come to acknowledge that. It doesn't mean necessarily that it's reducible to nothing but an expression of them, because in the case of Jewish intellectuals, there were charges against them that they were just simply Jewish intellectuals who were acting out their own pathologies as Jews, and that was what they wanted to, somehow offend against. Now, traditional Judaism, I think, in a way, of course, that's, what is up for grabs. The idea that there was a normative notion, an authentic notion, a notion that was, somehow once pure and has now been diluted and somehow hybridized, is what these guys in their complicated relationship to aspects of the tradition performatively call into question. That they get aspects of it, others they don't. They're not solely within it, they're somehow in this kind of complicated relationship to it.
Yeah, but you've shown them calling each other Christian, which is precisely what was done.
Well, I mean, there's always the issue of what constitutes the boundary. There's always the issue of what constitutes being somehow acknowledged as such and being seen as a heretic. I mean, that's why I mentioned the book by
which is again Ben Nazir, which is again another Christian concept.
Of heresy. Well, I mean, look, there are always, let's say, concepts that interpenetrate in ways that make it impossible. I mean, I'm not a serious student of Western religion, but I think it's clear that from the get-go, religion has been syncretic and has produced attempts at purification, codification, boundary keeping, and yet those boundaries are always porous. So that the traditions, especially that have been around for 3,000 or whatever years, are traditions which are amalgams of incredibly different and often even contradictory phenomena that then have moments of, the rappel à l'ordre in which they get rid of the things that are seen as problematic, and people are excommunicated, and Spinoza is excommunicated, whatever. And then you get, attempts basically to open it up to capacious, be syncretic, and a good hybridizer. So I don't think this is typical of Judaism or any other religion. If you look at the history of Christianity, God knows it's filled with all types of battles over boundaries and what's inclusive and not, and ways to purify and ways to return and ways to expand. And, I mean, that's what religion seems to me, if you take it seriously as a historical phenomenon, what gives it its life, its capacity to both absorb and, have struggles over what constitutes its essence. So I don't see it as particular to this, tradition. And I never the idea of somehow normatively excluding some group because they don't measure up to a notion of what is authentic always seems to be very dangerous, frankly. So that's my own investment in loose, capacious, forgiving, and in some sense heterodox versions of these kinds of traditions.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.